Some of you may remember the course I led here a couple of years ago with Dr. Harith Ramli, entitled Judaism and Islam, A Shared History. I'm currently adding to my notes and attempting to write it up as a book. And as part of that research, I've been studying some of the splendid Hebrew poetry written by Jews in Islamic Spain. In these terrible times when there's such an atmosphere of tension between our two faiths, it's even more important to acknowledge what Judaism and Islam have gained from each other over the centuries. Perhaps the best known Jewish song of all is Adon Olam. After all, everybody notices it because it's right at the end of the service. When my children were little and we lived near Menorah Synagogue in Manchester, Claire would bring them most weeks on a Shabbat morning in time for Adon Olam, and they soon learned to recognize it, even with the many different melodies. And it is noticeable even in our service today because of the very strong rhythm which contrasts with older Hebrew poetry. You can hear it in the simpler tunes. Ti-tum-tum-tum, ti-tum-tum-ra, ti-tum-tum-tum, ti-tum-tum-ra. You see, in the days of the Bible, poetry had almost no rhyme and very complex rhythms. But in the early centuries of Islam, Hebrew poets started adopting Arabic and Persian rhyme and rhythm. Adon Olam uses a simple version of a rhythm known as Hazaj, first used in the East, but which later spread to Spain, where so much Hebrew poetry was written, both secular and sacred. Poetry was a way of life in Spain. It was part of the Jewish school curriculum, and poems were written about every possible subject. Poetry for the synagogue often used Arab melodies like this, which might also be used for drinking songs. The words of Adon Olam, which you can see on the screen, are beautifully simple and understandable. The message is God rules the whole universe, but also has time to look after me. But below the surface, there's some quite complicated theological debates, starting with the meaning of the first two words, Adon Olam. Now, in our Siddur, we have a lovely verse translation, which you can see there, which actually mirrors the Arabic rhythm. And Adon Olam is translated as eternal God. But when we go into Kiddush and we say the blessings for the wine and bread, we translate Melech HaOlam as sovereign of the universe, HaOlam. Eternal implies God lives forever, God of all time. But sovereign of the universe implies God is the God of all space, of every possible place. So with the words Adon Olam, which is it? Does it mean God of all time or God of all space? In biblical Hebrew, Olam always means forever and time. But later on in rabbinic Hebrew, it took on the extra sense of forever in place. I think Adon Olam carries both senses. And the first two lines tell us that God created the world, but existed before that, which of course is obvious because God could not have created the world without pre-existing it. But the following two lines, just when we might have expected some account of how the creation was done or a historical event, we jump to a parallel time period in the distant future, when the universe is no more, but God remains. Lavado yimloch. It's very striking. God alone and completely unchanged. A lonely figure amidst empty space. Or perhaps there will be no space. Perhaps God will fill the gap between the universes until another one is formed. Complicated. The prophet Isaiah describes God as saying, I'm the first and I'm the last. And some rabbinic accounts talk of the world lasting for 6,000 years. We would say only 6,000. However, Judaism's greatest theologian, Moses Maimonides, insisted that the universe would never be destroyed. He disagreed with Adon Olam. And Jewish accounts of the end of the world tend to focus on what will happen to human beings rather than the end of the universe itself and the notion of God outliving it. Adon Olam is very striking and unusual in this image of God reigning alone in the future. And then, in lines 5 and 6, we have God's uniqueness and transcendence, and it adds that no other is to be joined to him. Lahach bira, from the root chaver, a friend or associate. We are not to think of God as having any associate. That is a notion which I think is taken here from Islam. Associating someone else, anything else, with God is called shirk and was strictly condemned in Islam. And I think this gives a tiny bit of evidence that Adon Olam was written in an Islamic environment. And then in verses 7 and 8, a startling change and a sudden one. God is a personal companion to the poet, shelter, banner, and refuge, and even offering the poem a cup. I remember Lionel Blue teaching about Adon Olam at Leobeck College and saying, God is my cup of tea. But notice how that first word at the beginning of the poem, Adon, God, at the end of the poem becomes Adonai, my God. God is with me, I shall not fear. Just as those first two words can be read in two ways, so the last two lines of the poem can be interpreted in two distinct ways. Perhaps it's about God being with the poet when sleeping through the night and waking up in the morning, or perhaps it's about the sleep of death and awaking in the world to come. In a brilliant insight, Rabbi Jonathan Wittenberg has pointed out that the word "and" in Hebrew can sometimes mean "and therefore." And therefore he translates this, into God's hand I entrust my soul at the time I sleep, and therefore I shall awake. And he adds, if we go to sleep calm, we can sleep without trouble. But if we are perturbed when we lie down, sleeplessness and worry will haunt us. So actually Adon Olam is a good thing to read last thing at night. Okay, so now we come on to its date and authorship. We don't know. We don't know who wrote it or when it was written. In his note at the back of our Siddur, our great and beloved teacher, Rabbi John Rayner of blessed memory, wrote, it is first found in 15th century prayer books. Most probably it was written in Christian Spain in the 13th or 14th century. But since he wrote those words, an earlier source and a very interesting one has come to light. Jeremy Schonfield, professor of liturgy at Leobeck College, has drawn my attention to research done by Professor Reuven Kimmelman of Brandeis University. You are going to find this very interesting and unexpected, as I did when I read it a few weeks ago. In the year 1287, 3 years before Jews were expelled from England by King Edward I in the year 1290, Rabbi Jacob ben Yehuda, the Chazan of Londres, which is London, completed a large compendium of Jewish law and practice reflecting the traditions of Jews here in this city at that time. Jews in England spoke Norman French, which is why they called London Londres or Londrets. Now, Jacob the Chazan, who wrote this book, called his compendium Eitz Chaim, the Tree of Life. And he must have taken his manuscript with him when he left for France, otherwise it wouldn't have survived. The Jews were then, for a while, expelled from France in the year 1306, and the manuscript went further east. According to a note written on the outside leaves, it was held by a German family named Bick, and eventually it ended up in the University Library in Leipzig, where it remains to this day. However, it was overlooked for centuries because in the catalogue, someone wrongly copied Londrets as an unknown place, Londitz. It was rediscovered in the 1890s by a scholar named David Kaufman, who wrote 3 articles about it. And he explained that not only does the book provide invaluable information on the customs and practices of medieval Anglo Jewry, but it also contains a complete prayer book for the whole year, with copious notes detailing where the wording as used in the prayers in England differed from the ones used in northern France. And at the end of the service, there is Kaddish, followed by Aleinu, the other way round from the way we do it now. And then after Aleinu, it says Adon Olam. So there we have it. The earliest known reference to the existence of Adon Olam and its use in the service comes from London in the year 1287. But who wrote it? And how on earth did it get to England? The Jews of England certainly wrote poetry. We have the verses of Mayor of Norwich to prove it, but not with a rhythm like that. It's definitely an Arabic rhythm. Professor Kimmelman suggests that the author might have been the wandering scholar Abraham ibn Ezra. He was born around the year 1090 in Muslim Spain in the town of Tudela, and he even had an Arabic name, Ibrahim al-Majid ibn Ezra, which means Abraham the Exalted One, son of Ezra. In 1137, he began a wandering life and is said to have got as far as Baghdad to the east and Oxford to the north. Unlike his younger contemporary Maimonides, who wrote mainly in Arabic, Ibn Ezra wrote his Bible commentary in Hebrew. He was a poet, a grammarian, a philosopher, an astronomer, and a mathematician, possibly the first to introduce a symbol for the number 0 into Europe. He certainly visited England and could easily have brought the poem with him. So, when we sing Adon Olam and think about God's distance and closeness, let us think of the Jews of London reading, or perhaps singing it, 700 years ago. How poignant the words must have been in those very difficult times of persecution as they feared for their lives. My living and redeeming God, my shelter on a stormy day, My banner and my refuge still, my cup of comfort when I pray. Into your hand I place my soul, asleep, awake, for you are near. And with my soul, my body too. You are my God, I shall not fear. Shabbat Shalom. And we continue.